First Book of Kings, chapters 9 to 11 today, and this one, unfortunately, we have to start with my correcting something that I completely ballsed up in the previous video. In that video I talked about how the Temple of Solomon, this super duper temple, seemed to be built in Lebanon. And in my defence, it's because there was talk of this chap who was the head of forced labour sending the shifts to Lebanon to do some sort of work. It seemed to me to suggest that that's where the temple was. But no, turns out the temple is in fact in Jerusalem, which makes a lot more sense. Not quite clear why people were going to Lebanon, but presumably to get stone and wood and stuff to bring back. I don't know, but Jerusalem and Lebanon, not that close. Bit odd. It does seem to be important though, because I think the Temple of Jerusalem does have a long part to play ongoing in this, and therefore important to clarify that I completely cocked that bit up. As a slight side point, through this project I've got this sort of weird thing where I keep collecting different Bibles that tell you different things in different ways, and I was able to check this with my super duper Bible archaeology study Bible, something like that. Basically like the stories, and then with some archaeological evidence and stuff pulled together in it. It's very good, very useful. I shall, if I can figure it out, put in a photo so you can see what it's supposed to supposedly look like in the archaeology study Bible. But this section anyway opens with God talking about his eyes and his heart will forever be in this temple. This is partly ties back to why it's important to know where this temple is, because the first temple of Jerusalem 400 years later, spoiler alert, gets knocked down. And I gather that's a bit of a recurring theme, that the temple of Jerusalem gets rebuilt and knocked down several times throughout the next few thousand years or 1,000 plus years. So yes, important to clarify this, and seemingly slightly odd at this stage that God is saying this, albeit might make a bit more sense in a minute. God reiterates his threat that if people don't follow him, Solomon in particular, then he will do terrible things and great things will not happen, and all this, that and the other, as we've had several times before. Somehow though, in this instance, because Solomon's been doing so well and everything seems pretty good, this seems ominous and a little bit foreshadowing. And as part of this, God says that Israel will become a byword for ridicule and that the temple will end up in ruins, which is interesting given that's exactly what happens shortly after, and I believe several times after that. The Queen of Sheba then turns up, who I had heard of. I have no idea why, where or how. I thought this was going to be a big deal. But she turns up, asks Solomon some very difficult questions because she's heard that he's a super duper wise man. Solomon apparently deals with these no problem, despite the fact we don't hear what any of the questions are or any of the answers. It sounds like they exchange some sort of gifts and then she disappears off home again. So, yeah, clearly not correct there. The Queen of Sheba, not significant, at least not in this part anyway. It's just a bit more labouring of the point that Solomon is super wise and that he's super rich as well. Following on from that, and noting the slightly foreshadowing negative vibe, it turns out that Solomon has a little bit of a soft spot for the foreign ladies. It notes that he has 700 wives and 300 concubines, and you just kind of, what were you thinking? Can't possibly have heard of Valentine's Day, can he? Because, I mean, that's just making a rod for your own back. Either you're spending forever doing cards and flowers, or you're spending forever in the doghouse. So either way, that just doesn't seem like a good plan. Anyway, God has specifically warned Solomon against all these foreign ladies because they will turn his heart away from them and towards other things and other gods. And indeed, as Solomon gets old, it notes that his heart does turn away from God and he does get corrupted by all these 700 wives and their funky gods. And it says that Solomon's heart is not truly devoted to God as David's was, which is interesting, isn't it? Because Solomon seems less the sinner and David very much the sinner, but David was, I don't think there was any suggestion at any point that he wasn't devoted to God. So David is definitely seen as the higher of the two, despite the fact he was less of a good man. Because apparently sin matters less than devotion, which is interesting. God, anyway, says that he's not going to take Israel away from Solomon during Solomon's lifetime, out of respect for David, which is odd. But then, sure enough, Solomon dies, seemingly of natural causes at a great age, I believe. There's nothing to suggest to the contrary. And looks slightly ominous, like Israel is going to pass on and somewhat fracture, which we'll have to find out in the next video. So in the short version of that story, we have Solomon is super wise, except for when it comes to ladies. That then massively displeases God, and then he dies. So nice and easy bit. In terms of the interesting points that come out of that, the first one that emerged as I was reading it, I was wondering, is this suggestion that these other gods that turned Solomon's heart away, is that a god in this sort of Jordan Peterson sense, where it's not actually God, it's just talk about something that you hold up as being your ideal, as it were, i.e. in Solomon's case, foreign women. But then it does go on to say specifically some gods he's following. So there is Ashtoreth, who's apparently a girl, Molech, who I believe was specifically banned under Leviticus, or maybe not quite 10 Commandments, I think, but in Leviticus I think it was given that Molech was specified as you can't give your sons to Molech, and Chemosh, I don't know. So it doesn't look like it is holding things up as in a higher place than your devotion to God as being other gods. It does actually specify other gods, so which makes no sense at all. If you're Solomon and you have spoken to God, you know he exists, you can see what he's done, and yet somehow you think, I'm just going to go and do these made up ones instead. I can't see any way that makes any sense at all, which suggests it's perhaps metaphorical. I don't know. I have to think about that one as we go, but that interesting idea about having other gods, which I guess, I say, links back to that sort of idea that Jordan Peterson's always on about when he talks about God, and it sounds like he's talking about God, but he's clearly not talking about God. He's just clearly talking about things that you hold in high esteem, or the thing you hold in the highest esteem, whether that's women or alcohol or whatever. The second point I've forgotten. I'm not political at all, and there's no intention for this channel to be political in any way. I'm far more interested in what I'm doing than what other people are doing. But you can't help but think, given the troubled history Israel has had, given that in the modern sense it's only existed since, the 1940s, and then there was a massive period where the Muslims drove them all out and nothing happened with the land or something, I believe. My history of Israel is not great. You can't help but look at that in the context of God saying, I will look after you as long as you do what I say, and then if you don't, your temple's going to fall down to rubble and you'll be cast out from the land. It's like, well, that all happened. And yeah, sure, I mean, it's possible that's just a thing, but I mean, it's a little bit spooky, isn't it? I mean, you've got to give it its due. Something sort of unique to the difficult history that Israel has had. And yeah, perhaps that might seem obvious in modern terms, but someone writing this 3,000 years ago, could they have known that? That seems unlikely. Just an interesting anyway, and I'm certainly not into all these predictions. My YouTube is obviously alive with all sorts of religious sort of things. And you do it, people talk about, is this the big event that marks the beginning of the end? It's like, no, don't be silly. And it's just, I don't believe any of that. That just seems daft. But when there's some interesting stuff that does tie up, it's interesting. I guess that's the point, isn't it? But yeah, so that is that next part of the story. We have some even more questions to answer, and we will go on the next one to see what we can find.